Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 122 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Going to be keeping it stateside this week, as I am proud to be bringing you an interview with a true icon in community corrections as far as I'm concerned. Dare I say, perhaps even an iconoclast. George Keiser is currently the CEO at Kaiser and Associates. Over the course of his career, though, George has played an integral role in the evolution of community corrections here in the United States and beyond. From his early work in Iowa to his work with the National Institute of Corrections, George has had a front row seat for some rather monumental developments in the field. I had the pleasure of first meeting George many years ago when we were both attendants at an ICCA conference. That's the International Community Corrections Association. George, I want to say it was either in Reno and or Cleveland when we first crossed paths at that conference. I was delighted to reconnect with him for this podcast opportunity. So please, sit back and enjoy my interview with the incomparable George Keiser, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome to the show, George. Why don't we start off, as I always do, by just sort of introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself, generally speaking, maybe some of your educational and vocational milestones, and then we'll do a deeper dive on some of these topics.
Important part, I guess the most important thing is I've been married to Rosemary for 54 years. And we have now been married long enough that we're in the process of building a house, a first and a last house that we will build. We have two daughters, and I got my two sons through marriage. And fortunately, I got good guys. We also have three granddaughters, so our family is very good at doing girls. And we moved out here to Sedona, Arizona. Actually, we live in a little village called the Village of Oak Creek, just south of Sedona, and with a Sedona mailing address. We moved out here in 2013 and couldn't be happier.
Well, family is important, and we all know the value of that. It sounds like you've got a great support system there. You've augmented your social capital as well, as we like to say. Can you, George, touch on some of the highlights, maybe the early portion of your career when you were working with Iowa's Department of Corrections? I know you were very close to the foundation of their correction system. I know you worked both in the institutions and then, of course, your work with community corrections organizations. Maybe cover a little bit of that portion of your career.
Be glad to. I got introduced to corrections more by accident than by design. Growing up on a farm in northwest Iowa, you don't have a lot of exposure, or I didn't back in the 1950s and early 1960s, to a criminal justice system. I did know that I wanted to go to Iowa State University, had no idea what I wanted to do, knew I was not going to be a farmer. I would have starved to death. While I was at Iowa State, though, in my sophomore year, a graduate student located me, and I don't know why, and invited me to start taking some criminal justice classes. And the professor at the time, Walter London, was a very hands-on kind of guy. So he took you out and exposed you to correctional institutions, to correctional settings. So it wasn't all classroom time, but it was also in the institution as well. In fact, we had one class where for a week we would go and stay in a hotel in Fort Madison, Iowa, and each day we would go in and spend a half a day in different departments of the institution, from food service to industry to security, exposing you to what did it mean to work in corrections. As a result of that, and through the assistance of another psychology professor of mine, I got an interview and an opportunity to work the summer between my junior and senior year as a correctional officer on the 2 to 10 shift at the penitentiary, and then could come in the mornings and work with the counseling staff on my own time. The combination of seeing the institution as a correctional officer sees it, and also from the perspective of the counseling staff, it made for a rich experience. In fact, when I came back after graduating and took a position as a correctional counselor, I had an inmate who had sent me a note saying he wanted to come over and see me. And when he arrived, he looked at me and with that look of, I've seen you before. And all of a sudden he turned around and he headed for the door. And I said, wait a minute, where are you going? And he said, well, I heard I had a new counselor who was fresh out of college. And so I was going to come over here and run a story on you. And he said, you worked in Cell House 19 last year, and you'd have known I was lying to you, and you'd have written me up. And so he started for the door again, and I said, no, wait a minute, you better let me sign your pass or somebody will write you up. But I figured that was an endorsement that I probably had gotten some of the best training I could get. So that
100%.
That got me in, and then the United States Army took me for a couple of years. I came back. I started at the penitentiary. I moved quickly to the men's reformatory. And from there, I moved on to the Department of Corrections had a Joint Commission accredited hospital, mental health hospital. And so I moved over to the hospital setting and in about 1971, I guess. From there, we were a part of a broad human service, social service system. And the Commissioner of Social Services decided he wanted to send people back to graduate school. And so the psychologist who ran the unit that I was on said, you have to go. And I said, well, there's other opportunity. No, you have to go get a master's degree. And so I went for a graduate degree purely out of thinking it would be a good union card for the future, not because academic institutions were thrilled with my presence, or was I thrilled to be on their campus. But it was also the opportunity to be exposed to what was emerging as this concept of community corrections in Iowa. I had my professor of public policy served as an advisor to the Iowa Crime Commission. And what I didn't know was that he, number one, wanted to leave the university and wanted to escape from all of his past work that he had done in criminal justice. And so he said, if I can get you to take my place as an advisor to the Crime Commission, would you like that opportunity? Well, what young 20-something who's really full of himself doesn't think he wants to do something like that? Right. What it allowed me to do was to be exposed to and to see the federal funds coming into the state of Iowa, see what the grant-making mechanism would be in on the ground floor as Iowa passed its first Community Corrections Act back in 1973, really saying this model program that has been created in Polk County, Iowa, ought to be available statewide. It was a very simple bill. It really focused on 5 elements of what they thought worked in that model and did not prescribe how that had to be done in the rest of the state, but said it ought to be available to the rest of the state. And so when I got done with graduate school, I owed the state of Iowa 2 years of time. And I went to central office and said to the guy who was running community corrections, I know where the money's coming from. I know how to get the grants out. I know what the legislation is. And he said, well, good, write a job description and let's go to work. And so that was my introduction. And over the next 3 years, we were fortunate that we had federal funding sufficient that we could run laboratories. And so different parts of the state did the same things, but they did them in different ways. And by 1976, it was obvious what we had to create was some kind of governmental structure, because we were now going to be out of federal funds and it would now turn into a state function in terms of financing. And so based on my exposure to the not-profit world through Goodwill Industries, I had seen the power of local boards of directors. And so I went to the head of the Crime Commission and said, if I can get legislation passed that would create multi-county regional community corrections agencies, would you let federal funds flow to those? And his response was, you can't get it done. And I said, no, that's not my question. My question is, if we can get it done, would you let the federal funds flow to those? And his response was, well, you can't get it done, but if you could, yeah, we would let that happen. And so with the legislative leadership of the lieutenant governor at the time, that's what we did. We passed legislation that created boards of directors made up primarily of individuals from county supervisors, elected officials from each county within the 8 judicial districts, so that there were 8 separate agencies. They had the same responsibilities, but they were not burdened by having to do all of the same things in the same way. You know, the rest of my time in Iowa was spent both around advancing community corrections. I did some stints as deputy director of institutions because I was the only person in central office who'd ever worked in one. And I also did a stint as the interim superintendent of the Women's Reformatory, when on a Friday afternoon at 4:30, the superintendent called the director of corrections and myself and said, I won't be here on Monday morning because I quit. And I'm leaving the keys and I'm leaving. So that was kind of my experience for the state of Iowa.
George, I say this as a compliment, but it's almost as if you could look back on your career there, and you're sort of like the Forrest Gump, as far as whenever there were these critical historical junctions in the trajectory of Iowa's correctional evolution. There was George Keiser. There was George Keiser. There was George Keiser. Just sort of, and again, as a compliment, right place at the right time, that you were fortunate enough to have, again, your hands on these changes as they went down. And you mentioned at one point, speaking of the Community Corrections Act and really that whole philosophy with the 8 judicial districts, same thing, same way. But again, that's sort of the spirit of community corrections, is that local control vis-a-vis that centralized top-down approach that other jurisdictions take. Say, many of our listeners are familiar with the NIC, our National Institute of Corrections, and the awesome work that they do. I know you spent 28 years with that agency, culminating with your role as Chief of Community Corrections Division. George, to the degree that you can, could you talk about the changes you saw in the field of corrections over that 28-year span?
Oh, I'd be glad to. Actually, I was introduced to NIC while I was still in the state of Iowa. They had created a network of state administrators who did not have direct administrative responsibility for community corrections in their state, but had an oversight, a funding, regulatory kind of function instead. And so it was indirect management, more influence of community corrections and direct management of community corrections. So that was my introduction to NIC. And as I came in, invited by the guy who had been the division chief, Larry Solomon. Initially, he said, I want you to come in on an IPA contract, an Intergovernmental Personnel Act. It's a 2-year contract. We can renew it once. What does that sound like to you? He said, you stay a government official in Iowa and you can return to Iowa. And I said, sounds good to me. Let's do it. And while we were in the process, things happened at NIC, and he called me one night and he said, I'm going to have to move from being director or division chief to being deputy director of the agency. Would you be willing to come in as the division chief? And I said, well, let me be sure I'm clear about this. I would still report to you and I'd make more money. And he said, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, I can't think of a reason not to do that. So when I came into the Institute, I said to Larry, if you read the legislation, this is really a hybrid organization. It's a combination of, while it was created masterfully by Bob Kutak writing legislation for Roman Ruska, the senator from Nebraska, it created a separate independent federal agency, but it had elements of a private not-for-profit. What I mean is it created an advisory committee, but in the very next sentence, after creating the advisory committee, it said that advisory committee could make policy for the agency, which anybody familiar with private not-for-profits knows if you make policy, that's very different than being advisory.
Right.
And there were some very key people initially who were involved in that creation. Norval Morris from University of Chicago Law School, Walter Menninger of the Menninger Foundation, Steve Horn, who was president of the University of California at Long Beach and later a one-term congressman, and Norm Carlson was director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And Norm's point was, we'll make a home for the Institute. We'll help them with administrative services such as personnel and finance and that kind of stuff. But he said it can't be the Federal Bureau of Prisons because states are not going to want to hear the Federal Bureau of Prisons telling them what to do.
Right.
So when I came in 1983, the focus really was on providing technical assistance and training for individual agencies.
Okay.
And while that was important, and NIC had started work in the area of community corrections classification, by the mid to the latter part of the 1980s, we realized if we really focused on making probation agencies and parole agencies the best that they could be, there was still a lot of other decision makers who could have a negative impact on that. And so at the encouragement of Al Schuman, who was running the probation department in Washington, D.C., he said, I really think you need to bring probation chiefs together with judges and with prosecutors so that they begin to understand the impact each has on each other. Because he said, otherwise, we in probation get whipsawed by the decision of prosecutors, who they're going to charge, what they're willing to accept in plea agreements, what they're fighting for. And he said, judges don't don't get this kind of training. So we really need to bring those together. So the 1980s began to be the first time that there was a federal agency that was really promoting a systemic approach to this kind of process. Phyllis Modley on our staff was powerfully involved in helping to create the concepts, the ideas, and then we had like-minded organizations who were willing to work with us in trying to make that a reality. By the 1990s, you had seen many probation and parole agencies shift from being, quote, helping organizations to becoming law enforcement organizations. I remember one occasion when a state director of probation and parole called me and said, well, we got the legislation passed. We're now a Class A state law enforcement agency. I said, so you're in the same class with the state troopers, is that right? And he said, yes. I said, if there's a budget cut on state law enforcement, who do you think's going to take the cut? You or the state troopers?
Right.
And so we were into buying Ford LTDs, starting to wear SWAT uniforms, and much more law enforcement focus. By the 1990s, one of my staff, Dave Dillingham, had started to import the Canadian research under a rubric of what we called What Works. And he and Peter Kinzinger from the old International Community Corrections Association crisscrossed the United States for the next 5 years, holding workshops with people like Ed Latessa and some of our Canadian colleagues, Donna Andrews and others, promoting this new idea of behavior change, not merely law enforcement, not merely catching people doing things wrong, but how do you really assess what puts these people at risk and how do you then target at reducing that risk? So that took place, really got started, and we spent 5 years in the early 1990s. And by the mid-1990s, I said, enough with the introduction. Either we have to prove that it really can be applied and done, or we ought to quit talking about it. And so we made the shift, made the move to start doing implementation within agencies and eventually within systems. The other thing that happened in the 1990s that NIC was instrumental in, we had created a large number of networks by then, similar to what I had experienced before, but bringing people together based on what their particular position called for within state and local governments. And part of what we were hearing was how broken the interstate compact system was. And while I was taking teams of people to China to teach conversational English in Chinese universities, and I could, within 24 hours, make hotel reservations in Beijing and other communities in China, it was taking at least 30 days of paper flow in order to get somebody to legally move from one state to another, let alone all of the people who were being transferred illegally. And so Kermit Humphreys on our staff, working with me, we decided we would take on a complete redo of the interstate compact, that it was so broken that technical assistance in and of itself, in fact, we held a series of hearings using some of our most influential board members from NIC. And at the end of it, the board said to us, don't provide any more technical assistance. It's a waste of money and it won't make a difference. And instead, they empowered us to go out and work at the creation of a new compact, creating the means by which we brought people together from a very broad spectrum, and allowed them to tell us what ought to go into the compact and the compact structure. We worked with the Council of State Governments, who were the premier organization with interstate compact experience, and that was the initial creation. They told us that if the compact were going to be adopted and take effect, it would probably take in the neighborhood of 7 years. Actually, 3 years later, all 50 states and 3 territories had signed on, and it became the act.
That's amazing.
Finally, in the 2000s, we really were working primarily at focusing on the criminal justice system, trying to bring evidence-based practice also into evidence-based policy, and trying to get more and more local policymakers, from county commissioners who were paying the bills to county executives, to judges, to prosecutors, to law enforcement, as well as community corrections, public defenders, to be at the table and to begin to articulate the outcomes before they started dictating the activities. Mm-hmm. And then to say, and does your funding of what you're doing match up and have any likelihood of creating the outcome that you say you want? And so we were into that into the 2000s. I left at the end of 2010. Just at the time, there was beginning to be a significant focus on implementation science, on the stages of change, which, had I stayed, I think that would have become my next real interest, would have been around organization and systems really moving more in the adoption of understanding how to successfully implement some of these changes. So that, in a nutshell, is 1983 to 2010.
And thank you for that very succinct trip down memory lane. I recall vividly the 90s, and as you noted, how that pendulum sort of swung to more of that law enforcement side, and we've been clawing our way back ever since. And yes, I think you're spot on as far as your assessment around implementation science really being the next challenge or the next frontier for corrections officials. I don't know if we're necessarily reinventing the risk needs responsivity mousetrap, for example, but yes, the devil's in the details as far as implementation goes. Not that you needed another amazing chapter of your life, but as you noted, you left in 2010, and since 2011, you have been the owner and CEO of Kaiser and Associates. What led you down that pathway, George, and what's that been like?
Well, I had thought I was leaving the Institute a couple of years earlier. We had been doing some joint ventures with the Jet Foundation, and Bob Crane as the president and CEO of that foundation. That had really spurred me to be more interested in doing prospecting for foundations and working jointly with foundations. And I thought it was going to be done. I was going to do that with the Jet Foundation until I got a call one Saturday morning and learned that the source of the money for the Jet Foundation had been Bernie Madoff, a guy who had just been charged, and the woman who was providing the funding for Jet found out that she didn't have any more money to put into it. So I knew it was time to leave the Institute, but I guess I didn't really want to leave the field. And the other reality was, crap, now that I've quit, I don't think I can live on my retirement. So I was very fortunate. I had just a couple of primary clients that I worked with for several years who overpaid me and underutilized me. And so that kept me in the game a little bit. And over the years, I guess I've been too lazy to go out and look for work, but I've been very fortunate that some work has come my direction, both domestic and international. And I concluded the last of my formal work a month before COVID shut down travel. So my timing on that worked out pretty well.
Yes, once again, impeccable timing there. You mentioned some of your international work, George. We have a mutual acquaintance in Arshak Gasparan. Share with us some of the work that you did with Arshak in the development of probation services in his country of Armenia.
Well, I had to look at the map to find out where Armenia was, and then when my wife looked and saw who the neighbors were, she wasn't so sure that it was very smart to be going. No, in 2016, the Armenian legislature had passed an evidence-based probation service in a country that had never had probation, had relied strictly upon a state prison system that had been strongly influenced by Russian culture and Russian approaches to governance. And so as they were trying to do some bridging more to the European side of the continent, they passed this legislation. It was very prescriptive, down to details of how many days between somebody coming into the system and having certain kinds of things take place. And so I was initially approached by Bob Brown, Canadian Bob Brown, not NIC Bob Brown, who said there's this organization that's getting funding from the State Department, and they're looking for people to write the manuals for probation staff and probation management to implement a state, in this case, national state probation service. And Bob asked if I and our British colleague, Steve Pitts, would be willing to join him in an application. And I said, sure. So he got us the funding, and then Bob Brown said, I don't want to do this. And besides, there's not that much money, so why don't you and Steve do it? And so Steve took on the role of writing a manual for probation and parole staff, and I wrote the management manual for this new department. Arshak was one of two internal national Armenian consultants. And part of what my focus was to look at who were the people who were coming together to create this new entity. And basically what had happened was their Ministry of Justice had reached into their prison system and seconded a number of experienced staff, brought them out and said, you are now the probation department. And at the same time, you had these bright, young, 20-something not-for-profit organization staff who knew about as much about evidence-based practice from reading and studying as anybody in the world. And so Steve and I were asked to come and bring our manuals and provide some training of trainers for these two groups in terms of how are you going to formulate, how are you going to put in place something that has never existed, that you've never seen before, and how do you convince some of your colleagues, some of the decision makers, some of the influencers that this is the right direction to go, not just because the law says you have to go this direction, but because you're really convinced that it's the right thing to do. And I vividly remember after getting to Armenia and walking in the first day to do training, and the training room is set up in the typical U with the trainers at the head of the U, and down one branch of the U are all of the former prison system staff who are now probation staff. And I suppose the youngest person would have been in their 30s, and many of them were in their 50s. And I look across to the other side of the U, and here's all these 20-somethings who are absolutely convinced that these old Turks don't know, well, I shouldn't say Turks in Armenia, that these old-timers don't know anything about what they should be doing. And so it was a fascinating experience to be able to bring this training to this group of people.
You mentioned, George, how, again, dealing with a nation whose probation system is starting from scratch. I have a little bit of experience with that as well. My usual listeners will know, because I often talk about the work I've done with the International Training School on Correctional Skills, which takes place in Barcelona. But when I was there last year, again, to your point, most of the students were from Eastern European nations who, again, probation systems were 20 years old at best. So
exactly.
different animal from having to sort of undo the ingrained cultural things that we sometimes deal with here in the United States, from undoing, like you said, other cultural things. You mentioned the influence of the former Soviet Union and how that sort of permeated a lot of their government way of thinking, program approaches. Yeah.
Well, I had been fortunate that, as I mentioned before, we would take teams of people to China, and we did that over about a 20-year period of time. I'd also had the opportunity through a couple of faith-based organizations to do a lot of international traveling and seeing different cultures from different perspectives. And even going back to when I was working with the 8 different districts in the state of Iowa, if you want to be successful, what you have to appreciate is not everybody's going to see the world the way you do. And they don't have to.
Right.
And so part of it is, how do you reduce concepts in ways that make sense within the culture in which you're trying to function? And if you can't do that, the likelihood that you're going to get anything across probably is pretty slim. And so part of that experience in Armenia was not to talk down to people, but to take information and to test with them. What's that relevance? So you're looking at Armenia is in their history the earliest nation in the world to profess Christianity as the moral compass or foundation for their society. So going into that training, you could talk about things out of the restorative justice kind of role, because they saw that from a faith-based perspective that was well ingrained within the country.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you said, understanding the different perspectives and the different context for which we're applying these evidence-based practices. So, for example, I often talk about the illustration of training motivational interviewing in different cultures, or, again, the risk, need, responsivity approaches in different cultures. But just realizing, okay, Joe, you've got to take yourself out of the United States / North American classroom, because, again, when I was training these principles to again, in particular, Eastern Europeans, I was realizing, okay, well, when we talk about things like absolute worth and again, these other principles, they're applying it to, say, they talked about their what they call their travelers or their gypsy population, or I realized it's a lot more pronounced. We don't tend to in the United States, when we think about our cultural differences, we tend to break that down along lines of race, for example, whereas in other countries, it's all about religion. I met a couple of folks from Ireland, and it's like, oh no, that cannot be understated. And I wouldn't think of again, in the United States, factoring in or using it as an illustration of, again, perspective taking on someone being a Protestant versus a Catholic, right?
Right.
I would go with, again, our U.S. lens of again, well, people of color versus white people, for example, stuff like that. But I realized, oh no, the way that folks, again, talked about, I had to stop the person at one point and saying, I'm sorry, who are you describing? Well, the the travelers, the gypsies, the ones that just sort of want to get on welfare and milk the system. And I've got to convince them that they've got to be employed because it's a condition of probation type thing. And I thought, okay, that's an argument I've never heard, or a population I've never heard discussed. But yeah, we're in a global marketplace of ideas, so to speak, here.
Well, I want to commend you, Joe, on if you're going to find a place to do that kind of training with Eastern Europeans, Barcelona is a marvelous location.
I could not agree more. I'll be back there in just a few short weeks, George. So if you're a student listening out there, yes, you're going to be in for some awesome training brought to you by, as we know, Professor Ion Dernescu, who's this international training school. It's his brainchild. So yes, those folks are in for a treat. And our very special keynote speaker this year is Fergus McNeil. So I'm interested and excited to reconnect with him again. George, look into your crystal ball. If I were to have you back on the program in a year or two, what do you think you might be sharing with our listeners at that point?
Well, the completion of our house first, Joe, so that I can show you great sunset pictures from my office window. I would hope there's several things that really disturb me right now, as we've talked about evolution from the 80s in through the early part of the 2000s. We had moved into a period of time when the concept of being evidence-based, evidence-informed, knowledge-driven really was true, whether it's education, medicine, law. As we have become dramatically polarized, accentuating our polarization and denouncing bodies of knowledge, I fear that we get elected officials where we run the risk that simply approaching our business from a knowledge base, if we don't have the strength of argument, if we aren't in a position to really push that knowledge-driven approach to behavior change, that we will become overwhelmed by emotionally driven prejudice in terms of how business ought to be structured and done. So I think that's one of the things we need to look very seriously at. The other focus would be around organizational development and implementation science. Part of what I realized in the training in Armenia, because Steve did his training piece first, I had the opportunity to sit back and watch the trainees, and all of a sudden it struck me that as I was going to be talking to them about stages of change and the steps of organizational development, there's a piece through the middle of that we never talk about, which is what are the emotions that are going on within an organization, within a system, as you approach those two concepts. And so how do those emotions play out? How do you, if you're a consultant, a facilitator, a manager, a supervisor, how do you anticipate what those emotions are going to be and not deny them, but to be able to work through them? And I think those are the kinds of things that I would hope that, again, as we move forward and as we continue to want to, as Don Evans would say, evidence-based doesn't mean you've ever arrived.
Right.
It doesn't mean it was here on a given date and you and that's all there is to it. We ought to be constantly creating new evidence that demonstrates an improved performance level, because we will never, ever arrive. It will always be a journey to being better at what we can be. And so those are the kinds of things that I would be looking at over the coming years, Joe.
I love Don Evans, and you're right. His notion that the science is never settled. I couldn't agree more. I've caught myself over the years, because I've gotten so partisan, if you will, about evidence-based practices. And even for example, not to get too in the weeds, but I'm not just an LSCMI trainer. I'm actually one of a handful of master trainers, so I can train trainers. But again, to that end, you've really got to drink the psychology of criminal conduct, Bonta and Andrews Kool-Aid, which I was chugging for years. But again, to your point, I realized I was almost being hypocritical if I didn't. As soon as I started to get exposed to some of the emerging desistance theories coming out of Europe, I thought, okay, time out, Joe. You need to practice what you preach here, or you're just, again, being hypocritical. So again, that's why I just love Don's input as far as evidence-based doesn't mean we've arrived and built, as I sort of referenced earlier, the perfect mousetrap. We have to keep challenging ourselves and keep looking for the next great thing. We just owe that to our stakeholders.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And we need to look beyond criminal justice and beyond the research that's going on in criminal justice. I visited an elementary school with a superintendent a week or so ago. I'm on an endowment committee, and we provided some funding to them. And as we were going through, he is showing me where they have taken from brain science information about how to be working with students who have certain learning needs, that they need some time out, some opportunity to calm and to be able to process that educational process differently than some other students do.
Yeah.
And so, again, you start thinking about our population, the trauma that they've experienced. You think about people who have been through physical injuries, head injuries, and you begin to ask yourself, what are we doing in terms of brain science, and how does that inform us about the competency and capacity of the individual I'm working with to be able to undertake this behavior change? And so there's a realm of science there that I don't think we've even begun to touch.
No, we haven't, George. I consider myself a lifelong learner. I'm in the midst right now of securing another graduate certificate. This one's in trauma, resiliency, and self-care. But a big portion of that talks about, as you noted, the brain science, the literal physical changes that occur in the brain. And as I'm learning all this, I keep thinking to myself, boy, again, where was this when I was learning all about the principles of risk, need, and I guess more to the point, responsivity, right?
Absolutely.
Again, we've really not scratched the surface of the human change process. As you said, I love that you're not just framing this as a criminal justice issue. One of the mantras of this program is I always try to tear down that binary us versus them approach we take to the clients we serve, as in, well, our treatments work on those people, but they're not like us. Well, no, we're human beings. We all learn the same. We all have the same brain. We all go through the same experiences, and like you said, trauma. So our approaches should be from that place as well. And again, yes, the brain science stuff. I know in 50 years, folks will look back and think, boy, we were barely scratching the surface with this. So it's all good. A great frontier for young listeners out there, young students thinking, how can I carve out my niche? Well, there you go. Start looking at, again, the brain stuff and the resiliency stuff and the trauma stuff, and how that doesn't necessarily compete with what we're doing here, but how it interacts and is intertwined. So
it informs. That's right.
And informs, exactly. George Keiser of Kaiser and Associates. I can't thank you enough, George. I love talking to you. This is a great history lesson, the last 50 years or so of corrections in the U.S. through that NIC lens and through the lens of all the great work you've done in Iowa. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you again someday, George.
Been my pleasure.
Take care, friend.
You bet.
A big Criminologist podcast thank you to George Keiser. Continue to enjoy your retirement in Arizona, my friend, until we cross paths again. I made a few references during this episode to the International Training School on Core Correctional Skills coming up in October of 2022 in Barcelona, Spain. We are capping attendance at 24 students because we really want to have an ideal learning environment. But there are a few seats still available. I will leave registration information and a link in the description of this podcast episode. If you're interested, I encourage you to check that out. Of course, if you're listening to this podcast after October of 2022, perhaps you can circle it on your calendars and prepare for the training school in 2023. You will also see a link in the show notes for this episode entitled Become a Supporter. Simply click on that link to learn details of how you may show your support for this podcast by becoming a supporter of the program for as little as $3 per month, or you can save some money by opting to become a yearly supporter. Check that out if you or your agency, again, are looking for ways to show your appreciation for the program. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is on Twitter. You may follow us at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. And if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Hey, merchandise is available, and I've made it even easier to get your hands on some groovy Criminologist merchandise. Simply visit our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, and you will see a tab labeled Shop. Go ahead and click on that Shop tab, and you'll get all the information you need to score some really cool swag. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And so we were into buying Ford LTDs, starting to wear SWAT uniforms, and much more a law enforcement focus.
Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.